For 12 years, Eleanor Whitmore was the perfect wife of one of London's most powerful men. She wrote the campaigns, saved the contracts, and rebuilt the image of Hawthorne Global, but Alexander was the one who received the applause. Until the night she opened the door to a secret apartment in Mayfair and found his mistress wearing his shirt, standing beside the £1 million proposal Eleanor had created. The same proposal another woman was about to claim as her own. Alexander expected tears. Vanessa expected shame. But Eleanor left only her wedding ring on top of the stolen folder and walked out carrying the one object capable of bringing the entire empire down, her old notebook. The next morning, Hawthorne Global's expansion is frozen, investors panic, and London discovers that the woman treated like decoration was, in fact, the mind behind everything. Eleanor Grace Whitmore had never wanted to be invisible. That was important to understand about her. She had not chosen this. She had not walked into her marriage with Alexander Hawthorne intending to disappear. She had walked in with a first-class degree from the London School of Economics, 3 years of brand strategy experience at a top-5 consultancy, and a notebook full of ideas so sharp they made people uncomfortable at dinner parties. She had been 28 when she met him. He was 31, recently appointed as Deputy Director of Hawthorne Global, the luxury real estate and development empire his grandfather had built and his father had grown, and his mother now quietly controlled from behind a curtain of charitable boards and pearl necklaces. Alexander was handsome in a way that photographed well. Dark hair, square jaw, the kind of face that belongs on the cover of a magazine about men who own boats. He was charming. He was attentive. He laughed at her jokes and read the book she recommended and told her, on their 4th date, that she was the most intelligent person he had ever taken to dinner. She had believed him. She had believed him completely. They married 18 months later in a ceremony at a Cotswolds estate that belonged to a Hawthorne cousin. Eleanor wore ivory. Margaret Hawthorne wore an expression of measured approval, the closest thing to warmth the woman possessed. Eleanor's mother, a secondary school art teacher from Derbyshire, stood in the receiving line looking slightly dazzled, slightly out of place, squeezing her daughter's hand and whispering, "You deserve every bit of this, love." The first year was good. She will say that honestly, even now. The first year was genuinely good. She had a role at Hawthorne Global. Not formally hired, never formally hired, because Margaret had made it clear that board wives don't work in the company. It creates confusion, but an informal advisory position. She sat with Alexander in the evenings and helped him think through proposals. She redesigned the brand communication strategy for their South Kensington development and watched it sell out in 6 weeks. She rewrote the investor letter that went out in March and received, through Alexander, a compliment from the CFO about its unusual clarity. Unusual clarity. She'd turned that phrase over in her mind like a stone, as though clarity were a quirk, as though intelligence in that context was a surprise. By year 3, the pattern had calcified. She was the idea. He was the voice. She drafted. He delivered. She solved, he announced. She was always there, always at the table, always in the room, always relevant, but never quite visible. If she spoke directly to a board member about a strategy, Alexander would later mention to her gently that it made things complicated. If she emailed a proposal under her own name, his assistant would quietly redirect the conversation back through his office. The system was so smooth, so practiced, that Eleanor sometimes wondered if it had been designed before she arrived. If she had simply walked into a machine already built to process women exactly like her. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself this was a partnership, that what was his was hers, that the success of Hawthorne Global was a success she shared even if her name appeared nowhere in the annual report. She told herself she was being practical, strategic, patient. She told herself these things with the discipline of someone who has learned that the alternative, seeing clearly, naming what was happening, demanding what she deserved, would cost more than she was prepared to pay. What she did not tell herself, because she was not ready, was this: a woman who makes herself invisible to keep the peace is not keeping the peace. She is paying for it, in silence, in daily installments, until the day the bill comes due. The bill arrived on a Tuesday in November in the form of a gold key and a silk-robed woman named Vanessa Cole. Eleanor had known Vanessa professionally for 2 years. She was sharp, well-dressed, American-educated, with the kind of confidence that reads as competence, until you look closely enough to see they are not the same thing. She'd joined Hawthorne Global as an external strategy consultant 18 months ago. Brought in by the board, Alexander had said, with an inflection that suggested Eleanor shouldn't ask further. Eleanor had not asked further. She had instead noticed things. The way Vanessa's proposals used frameworks Eleanor had sketched informally in meetings. The way certain phrases migrated from Eleanor's notebooks into Vanessa's presentations. The way Alexander looked at Vanessa across conference tables, not with desire, Eleanor had thought at the time, with gratitude, the look of a man who has found another source. She had not understood then what that meant. She understood it now. Standing in the doorway of apartment 14C, watching Vanessa Cole set down a wine glass with the unhurried calm of a woman in her own home, Eleanor understood everything. Eleanor. Vanessa's voice was even, controlled. She had clearly rehearsed for this, or something like it. How did you get in? The key, Eleanor said simply. A pause. He told me he lost that. He did lose it. In the pocket of a coat. People lose things all the time. Eleanor stepped further into the apartment, her eyes not on Vanessa but on the table. The papers. The familiar architecture of a campaign she had built from nothing over 4 months of late nights, while Alexander slept beside her, claiming exhaustion, claiming stress, claiming the weight of running a company that she had been propping up from the shadows. That's the Hartwell expansion proposal. Vanessa said nothing. I wrote that, Eleanor said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact, delivered the way you state coordinates. This is where we are. I wrote every line of it. The market segmentation, the investor narrative, the risk mitigation framework, the projected timelines. I wrote it between midnight and 4 in the morning over 14 weeks. Alexander presented it tonight as his own work. And now it's here. She looked up. With you. Vanessa lifted her chin. You should talk to your husband. I'm sure I should. Eleanor looked at the table a moment longer. Then she reached up and removed the ring from her left hand. Slowly, without drama. The way you remove something you've been wearing so long you've stopped noticing its weight. She set it on top of the proposal folder. It made a small, precise sound against the paper. Tell him, she said quietly, that I took the notebook. She picked up the old grey moleskin that had been sitting beside the wine glasses. Her notebook, the one she'd spent years filling with ideas, frameworks, calculations, source documents, early drafts. The one that could prove, entry by entry and date by date, who had actually been thinking in the Hawthorne household. She walked to the door. Eleanor. Vanessa's voice had changed. There was something in it now that wasn't quite control, something that sounded, if Eleanor was reading it correctly, like warning. You don't know the whole story. Eleanor paused with her hand on the doorframe. She considered that. She considered Vanessa's face, the careful set of it, the way her eyes held something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite satisfaction either, something older than this apartment and this affair. No, Eleanor agreed. Not yet. And she left. Chapter 2. The morning. Everything accelerated. She did not go home. That was the first decision. Small, practical, definitive. She did not return to the Belgravia townhouse she and Alexander had lived in for 9 years, the one with the walled garden she'd redesigned twice, and the kitchen island where she'd done most of her best thinking, and the bedroom where she'd lain awake more nights than she could count, working through proposals in her head while her husband breathed steadily beside her, untroubled. She got into a taxi on the wet Mayfair street and gave the driver the address of a hotel in Marylebone she'd stayed at years before a conference, during a trip Alexander had not accompanied her on because bored optics. Eleanor, you know how it looks. She knew how it looked. She had always known how it looked. She had adjusted her entire life to how it looked. In the hotel room, she ordered tea she didn't drink and sat at a desk by the window and opened the notebook. She already knew what was in it. She'd written every word. But she read it now, the way a lawyer reads a brief, systematically, noting dates, sourcing her own work like evidence she would need to present to a jury. And it was all there. The Hartwell proposal, tracked from its earliest spark in March through every iteration, every model, every rewrite. The Kensington launch campaign from 2 years ago. The Dubai investor brief she'd constructed in 3 days when Alexander had called her in a panic. The crisis communication framework that had saved the company during the planning dispute in Edinburgh. Her handwriting, her dates, Her mind, documented meticulously, as it had always been, because she was the kind of person who understood that clarity was preservation. At 2 in the morning, she made 2 calls. The first was to Catherine Webb, her university friend who had become one of London's better-regarded intellectual property solicitors. Catherine answered on the 3rd ring with the immediate alertness of a woman whose profession had trained her to treat late calls as serious ones. "I need to talk to you," Eleanor said. "Not as a friend. Professionally." "Tell me," Catherine said. Eleanor told her. All of it. Calmly, in order, with dates and document titles and names. By the time she finished, the tea was cold, and Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "The notebook," Catherine said finally. "That's what matters most. If the dates in it predate any filing or presentation by Hawthorne Global." "They do. By months in most cases." "And you have no formal employment contract with the company?" "No." A pause. "That's actually better. It means there's no IP assignment clause that could complicate your claim. The work product belongs to you personally, not to any employment arrangement." Another pause. "Eleanor, how long has this been going on?" 12 years. The silence on the line was the most eloquent thing Catherine Webb had said all night. "Right," she said at last. "I'll have something drafted by morning. A legal notification. We'll block the Hartwell filing until intellectual property ownership is established. It'll hit the company's legal counsel by 8 a.m. "That will stop the expansion," Eleanor said. "That will stop everything," Catherine agreed. There was no satisfaction in her voice, only precision. "Are you sure?" Eleanor looked at the ring-shaped imprint on her left finger where the ring had been until 2 hours ago. She thought about 14 weeks of midnight work. She thought about tonight's dinner, Alexander's hand on his wine glass, his comfortable certainty. "Completely," she said. The second call was shorter. It went to a journalist named Marcus Osei at the Financial Chronicle, who had been trying to profile Eleanor for 3 years and whom she had always politely declined. This time she said, "Not yet, but keep next week free." She slept 4 hours. It was enough. By 8:15 the next morning, Hawthorne Global's legal department had received Catherine's notification. By 8:45, the CFO had called an emergency board meeting. By 9, the company's stock, not publicly traded, but tracked by the institutional investors who held stakes through private funds, had dropped 3 points in informal pre-market sentiment. By 9:30, Alexander Hawthorne was standing in the kitchen of their Belgravia townhouse, calling her mobile for the 4th time, leaving voicemails that progressed in emotional temperature from confused to concerned to, by the 4th one, something close to frightened. Eleanor listened to none of them until noon. She was busy. She was in a glass-fronted office building in Canary Wharf, sitting across from a woman named Diana Frost, who ran the London office of a global brand strategy firm that had been trying to recruit Eleanor through a headhunter for 7 months. Eleanor had declined each approach. She had declined because leaving felt complicated, because she told herself she was invested in Hawthorne Global's success, because she kept doing what she had always done, finding reasons to stay small. She had called Diana at 7 that morning. Diana had cleared her calendar by 8. "I want to discuss a formal engagement," Eleanor said, sitting very straight in a chair that faced floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames. She had her notebook open on the table between them. Not as a consultant, as a partner. Diana Frost was 54 years old, had been in the industry for 3 decades, and was not easily impressed. She looked at Eleanor over the rim of her glasses and said, "Show me what's in the notebook." Eleanor showed her. Diana turned pages in silence for 6 minutes. She was the kind of reader who showed nothing on her face, which Eleanor appreciated. When she reached the last dated entry, she closed the cover carefully and looked up. "This is the Hartwell proposal," she said. "The one that was presented last night to the Hawthorne board." "Yes. Your work. Every line of it. And you have 12 years of material like this?" "More. This is just the primary notebook. I have digital backups. Time-stamped. Cloud-stored. Backed up in 3 locations because I am," Eleanor said, with something that wasn't quite a smile but was in its neighborhood. "A very organized person." Diana Frost put both hands flat on the table. "Eleanor, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not strategically, not protectively, honestly. Have you ever in 12 years had anyone look at the full breadth of your work and tell you what it was worth?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "No." she said. "No one has ever done that." "Then let me be the first." Diana leaned forward. "It's worth considerably more than you've been receiving." By 2 o'clock, Eleanor had a preliminary offer letter in her email. By 3, she had begun compiling the documentation her solicitor needed. By 5, she had found a furnished flat in Clerkenwell available from the 1st of the month, and paid the deposit from an account she'd maintained in her own name. Quietly, carefully, a small private financial life she'd kept, precisely because some part of her had always known that a woman should never be entirely dependent on a man who does not see her. Alexander called 11 times. She answered once, briefly, at 4:15. "Eleanor, whatever you think is happening, I don't think anything is happening," she said. "I know exactly what has been happening for a very long time. Catherine Webb will be in touch with your legal team. Please don't contact me directly again until she has." "You're doing this over Vanessa." "Eleanor, it's not. It's complicated. It's not what—" "It was never just about Vanessa," Eleanor said. "That's the part I need you to understand. This isn't a marriage crisis, Alexander. This is an intellectual property crisis. Those are two very different problems, and I suggest you speak to your board about the second one before they find out from the press." She ended the call. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, for the first time in years, like herself. Chapter 3. Vanessa's Story and the Older Wound. There are two kinds of women who become the other woman. The first kind knows exactly what she's doing and makes a calculation. The man has more to offer than he costs. The wife is an obstacle rather than a person. Desire is a tool as much as it is a feeling. The second kind arrives at it through a door that was already open before she appeared, carrying a wound that the situation seems temporarily to address. Eleanor had assumed Vanessa Cole was the first kind. She revised this assumption on Thursday, 4 days after the night in Mayfair, when Vanessa Cole called her directly and asked to meet. They sat across from each other in a quiet cafe in Bloomsbury on a grey November afternoon, which felt appropriately literary and slightly absurd. Vanessa ordered black coffee. Eleanor ordered the same. They looked at each other with the complicated attention of two women who had been occupying the same story from different angles. "I'm not here to apologize," Vanessa said. "I think you've already moved past the point where an apology would mean anything." "Correct," Eleanor said. "I'm here because I think you deserve to know something, and because—" Vanessa paused, turned her coffee cup a quarter turn. "Because I've been doing something I'm not certain I'm proud of, and I think you might be the only person who needs to hear it." Eleanor said nothing. She waited with the patience of someone who had spent 12 years listening to subtext. "My mother's name was Patricia Cole," Vanessa said. "She went to school with your mother-in-law. Not socially. My mother was a scholarship student. Margaret Dunmore, as she was then. A beat. Margaret Hawthorne, as she became." The air in the cafe was warm and smelled of coffee grounds and rain-damp coats. Eleanor felt something sharpen inside her attention. "Go on." "My mother was a designer. She worked in architectural interiors in the early 90s. She had a concept, a whole methodology, actually, for integrating residential and commercial design principles for high-end developments. She pitched it to a firm." Vanessa looked down at her coffee. "That firm had a connection to a young man named Robert Hawthorne, Alexander's father. The methodology was never credited to my mother. The firm licensed it to Hawthorne Developments under a different name, with a different author. My mother fought it for 3 years and then ran out of money and gave up." She looked up. "The foundation of the design philosophy that Hawthorne Global used to build their early reputation, the thing that made their early developments distinctive, that attracted the investors, that created the prestige, came from Patricia Cole, who received nothing, who was told specifically that the work was too sophisticated to have originated with someone of her background." A pause. She knew what that meant. Eleanor was very still. Margaret knew about this. Margaret orchestrated it. The silence stretched between them. Outside, a bus went past the window, people walking fast in the rain, London continuing with its daily indifference. "Why did you go to Alexander?" Eleanor asked, not accusingly, genuinely, because she needed to understand the shape of it. "Because I was angry," Vanessa said. "I'd been angry for 20 years on my mother's behalf, and when I found out who he was, I told myself I was going to get close enough to expose the company, document the pattern. That part was real. The rest of it—" She stopped. "The rest of it was more complicated than I intended it to be. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't." Her voice was level, but something behind it wasn't. And then I found out about you, what you were doing, what they were doing to you, and I realized the pattern hadn't changed at all. It had just found a new target in the same house. Eleanor looked at her for a long time, long enough for Vanessa to look slightly uncertain, which was not an expression that came naturally to her face. "Do you have documentation?" Eleanor asked. "About your mother's work, its similarities to the Hawthorne design methodology?" "Yes, everything my mother kept." "Can your legal counsel share it with mine?" Something shifted in Vanessa's expression. "That's not the question I expected." "I'm not interested in the expected questions," Eleanor said. "The interesting question is, if two separate cases of intellectual theft by the same family can be documented across 3 decades, what does that become legally? And in the press?" Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "It becomes a pattern of conduct." "It becomes a pattern of conduct," Eleanor agreed, "which is a different kind of case entirely from a single property dispute." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I don't particularly want to be allies with the woman who was sleeping with my husband. I want you to understand that clearly. But I also recognize that what your mother was owed and what I am owed have the same origin, and that Margaret Hawthorne has spent her career believing that certain women are decorative, invisible, easily deleted." She paused. "I'm not interested in correcting that belief one woman at a time." Vanessa looked at her steadily, and for the first time in this conversation, Eleanor saw something in her face that wasn't performance or strategy or careful control. Something genuine, which was perhaps admiration, perhaps recognition. "My solicitor's name is James Okafor," Vanessa said. "I'll have him call Catherine Webb today." "Good." Eleanor picked up her coffee. "And Vanessa, when you told me that night that I didn't know the whole story, was this what you meant?" "Partly," Vanessa said. She hesitated. "Margaret knew about Alexander and me. She approved. She thought that if Alexander felt satisfied outside the house, he'd remain less reliant on you. She was trying to make you more replaceable. She didn't know—" Another pause. "She didn't know that I was also looking for what I was looking for." Eleanor absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of her finest and most costly skills. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. She paid for both coffees. It seemed like the correct move. Chapter 4. What the notebook contained. The thing about being invisible for a long time is that you become extremely good at documentation. This is a survival instinct, and it manifests differently in different people. Some women photograph things, some women keep texts, some women build paper trails so meticulous that a forensic accountant would weep with admiration. Eleanor Whitmore kept notebooks. She had kept notebooks since she was 17 years old, because a teacher had told her once that ideas don't have inherent value. They have documented value, and she had taken that in and made it a practice as fundamental as breathing. There were 7 notebooks in total, spanning 12 years, plus an external hard drive, plus a cloud storage account with time-stamped files going back to 2012, plus email threads, the kind that live forever in servers in foreign countries, showing her sending draft proposals to her own account before forwarding them to Alexander, showing her asking Alexander in writing if she could attend the Edinburgh meeting directly, and his reply, "Better if it comes from me, love. You know how they are. You know how they are." She had 43 instances of that phrase or its functional equivalent in documented form. Her legal team, Catherine Webb plus 2 colleagues from the IP department, spent 2 weeks reviewing the material. Eleanor sat in the conference room for 3 of those days and answered questions with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this, unconsciously, for over a decade. The preparation had not been strategic. It had simply been how she worked, carefully, thoroughly, with a preference for clarity over comfort. The Hartwell case was the strongest. 14 weeks of documented development, all in her handwriting, all predating the presentation by which Alexander had introduced the proposal as his own work. But the Hartwell case was not even close to the most valuable thing they found. On a Tuesday in December, Catherine called her into a meeting and spread 3 pieces of paper on the table. "Do you remember the Sanderson brief?" Catherine asked. Eleanor did. 4 years ago, a major institutional investor, an American fund, had been considering a substantial commitment to Hawthorne Global's commercial portfolio. The relationship had stalled. Eleanor had, over a weekend, completely reconstructed the investor narrative, changed the language, the structure, the financial modeling framing. Alexander had presented the revised brief on a Monday. The investor had committed on Wednesday. The Sanderson commitment was worth £400 million to Hawthorne Global's leverage position, Catherine said. And here is what I need you to look at. She pushed the papers forward. The brief you wrote. The brief as filed with Sanderson. The brief as referenced in the company's financial disclosures. Eleanor looked. She saw what Catherine was showing her. Her brief, the one she'd written, had included a specific risk analysis framework, a 7-point methodology she'd developed, which accounted for market volatility in ways the company's standard approach didn't. That framework had been embedded in the company's financial product documentation for 4 years. It had been cited, without attribution, in the prospectus for a related bond issuance 18 months ago. A bond issuance that had raised considerable funds from institutional investors who had relied, partly, on that framework. This has moved beyond intellectual property of creative works, Catherine said. This is potentially in the territory of financial instrument disclosure. She worked that territory with the same patience and deliberateness with which she worked everything. Eleanor, the framework you created was represented in those filings as proprietary Hawthorne Global methodology developed by their internal finance team. Those investors made decisions partly on that basis, without knowing the true origin. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of this. What does that mean legally? It means that Hawthorne Global may have a disclosure problem with their investors that goes beyond what I initially thought we were dealing with. Catherine paused. It also means that the people who need to know about this aren't just in the company's boardroom. Some of them are institutional investors who have a right to accurate information about the intellectual foundations of the financial products they hold. Eleanor looked at the 3 pieces of paper for a long time. She thought about the nights she'd spent building that framework. She remembered the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the cold tiles under her bare feet, the feeling of working through a problem until it solved itself, the specific private satisfaction of understanding something clearly. She remembered Alexander sleeping upstairs. She remembered setting the completed brief on the counter and going to bed, satisfied, and waking up to find him already downstairs reading it, nodding slowly, already composing himself into the shape of a man who had produced something. She thought about Patricia Cole and her mother's stolen methodology, and Margaret Hawthorne's long, comfortable certainty about which women mattered. I want you to contact Marcus Osei at the Financial Chronicle, she said. Not yet. But I want him briefed under embargo so he understands the full scope. When this becomes public, I want it understood correctly, not as a marriage breakdown, not as a personal grievance, as what it actually is. She looked at Catherine. A pattern, a company built partly on uncredited work by women who were treated as resources. That's the story. I want it told that way. Catherine wrote something in her pad. The board meeting is scheduled for January 15th. They've been asking to meet with you. I know. Eleanor stood, gathered her things. Let them ask. I'll be there. Eleanor, Catherine set her pen down. I want to be sure you understand. Once this becomes a formal legal action at the scale we're now discussing, there is no version of this where the relationship is repaired. With Alexander, with the Hawthorne family, with any of it. Eleanor picked up her bag. She was wearing a camel coat she'd bought in Paris 8 years ago, the kind of coat that improves with age, that becomes more itself the longer it exists. She thought that was something to aspire to. Catherine, she said pleasantly, I'm not trying to repair anything. I'm trying to get back what's mine. She walked out into a London afternoon that was cold and clear and full of the particular kind of winter light that makes everything look temporary and precise. Chapter 5. The room where invisible women speak. The 15th of January was a Thursday. Eleanor arrived at the Hawthorne Global offices on Bishopsgate at 9:45, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. She wore a black suit she had bought the previous week, not her usual style, which ran to warmer tones and softer fabrics, but correct for this room, for this morning, for what she was about to do. She wore her hair up. She wore the earrings her mother had given her for her 30th birthday. She carried the grey notebook in her bag. She had been to these offices many times. She had sat in the lobby waiting for Alexander. She had attended 3 company events in the main conference suite. She had twice been escorted politely to a side room, while a meeting she had prepared for took place without her in the room next door. The receptionist at the front desk looked up as she approached. and smiled the professionally neutral smile of a person uncertain of what category Eleanor belonged to. "Eleanor Whitmore," Eleanor said, "for the board meeting." "Of course," the receptionist said, slightly unsure. "I'll just let them know." "Please," Eleanor said, and sat down. They came to collect her 4 minutes later. Not a junior assistant, as she might have expected, but the CFO himself, a compact, careful man named Jeffrey Marsh, who had worked at Hawthorne Global for 20 years and who Eleanor suspected had understood, for most of those years, more about her contribution to the company than he had ever said aloud. "Eleanor." He shook her hand with both of his, which said something. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," she said. He led her into the executive conference suite on the 14th floor. She had been in this room twice. She had never sat at the table. There were 9 people at the table, 6 board members, including 2 institutional investor representatives, the company's general counsel, the CFO beside her, and at the far end of the table, Alexander, who looked like a man who had not slept well in a month, which was accurate, and beside him, very straight in her chair, Margaret Hawthorne. Margaret was 71 years old and had the posture of a woman who had decided, at some point in her 40s, to become architecturally perfect. She wore grey. Her hair was immaculate. Her face, when she looked at Eleanor, showed nothing at all, which Eleanor recognized now as a form of contempt so practiced it had become involuntary. Alexander stood as Eleanor entered. He looked like he might say something personal. She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely clear. Not here, not now, not this. He sat back down. Eleanor took the seat at her end of the table. She placed the notebook in front of her and her hands flat on either side of it and looked at the room. "Good morning," she said. "I understand the board has questions about the Hartwell proposal and the broader IP situation. I'm here to provide clarity." She paused. "I appreciate that the company has been waiting to have this conversation for several weeks. I want you to know that the delay was not capricious. I needed time to ensure that my documentation was comprehensive. It now is." One of the investor representatives, a Scottish woman named Jean Baxter, who Eleanor had seen at 3 events and exchanged words with once, said, "Mrs. Whitmore, or Ms. Whitmore, I want to ask you directly. The claim you're making about the Hartwell proposal, can you substantiate it completely?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Can I walk you through it?" "Please." Eleanor opened the notebook. She had marked the relevant sections with tabs. She began to speak. She spoke for 45 minutes. She was precise and organized and completely without theatrics. There were no tears, no accusations, no moments of elevated emotion. She presented her work the way she had always done, in the privacy of her kitchen at 2 in the morning, with clarity, with structure, with evidence. She took the board through the Hartwell proposal entry by entry. She presented the Sanderson brief and its embedded framework and the subsequent financial filings. She briefly summarized, with reference to documentation provided by James Okafor, the parallel situation of Patricia Cole, and the foundational design methodology that had shaped the company's early identity. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Alexander had not spoken. He sat with his hands on the table and his face arranged into an expression Eleanor had never quite seen on him before. Not the polished composure of the boardroom, not the easy warmth he deployed socially, but something rawer and less practiced. She looked at him for a moment and felt with some surprise, almost nothing. Not anger, not love. A kind of clean comprehension, the way you feel when you finish a very long equation and see that the answer was obvious all along. It was Margaret who spoke. She did it the way she always did everything. Controlled, measured, with the timing of a woman who had run rooms for decades. "Eleanor," she said. The word was designed to sound like an acknowledgement and function as a dismissal. "This family, Margaret." Eleanor looked at her mother-in-law directly. She had spent 12 years avoiding this look, the direct, fully engaged, nothing hidden look of a person who is no longer managing anyone's comfort. "I want to be very precise about something. This is not a family conversation. There are board members and investor representatives at this table, and what I have presented is a legal matter that they have an obligation to address. I'm not here to discuss the family." She paused. "I'm here because the company's intellectual assets need to be correctly attributed. The financial filings that relied on those assets need to be reviewed for accuracy, and the individuals whose work those assets represent need to be properly compensated. Those are the three things I require. That is the full scope of my presence in this room. Margaret held her gaze. She was very good at the gaze. She had spent a lifetime deploying it, but Eleanor had also spent a lifetime, and the particular lifetime she'd spent had given her something Margaret did not have, the absolute, bone-deep certainty of a woman who has seen herself clearly and found that what she saw was enough. Margaret looked away first. Geoffrey Marsh said, very quietly, "I think we need to suspend today's agenda and speak with legal." John Baxter said, "Agreed." One of the other board members said, "The Hartwell filing will need to be held." "It's already held," Eleanor said. "My solicitor addressed that in December. The filing cannot proceed while IP ownership is in dispute. I'm not trying to destroy the expansion. I'm trying to ensure it proceeds with accurate documentation about who created the proposal that makes it viable." She looked at the investor representative. "That's information your funds need to have. I think you'd agree." John Baxter looked at her with the measured attention of a woman who had also spent a long time in rooms where her presence was considered optional. "Yes," she said, "we would." Alexander, at the far end of the table, finally spoke. His voice was quieter than usual and more honest, and she thought it might be the most honest she had heard it in years. "Eleanor, I know that..." He stopped, tried again. "I know that what you're describing is real. I know I should have..." "Alexander," she said, not unkindly, "this really isn't the moment." He closed his mouth, and she saw something happen in his face, in the exact configuration of muscle and bone that she had studied for 12 years. She saw him understand, perhaps for the first time fully, what he had actually lost. Not a wife who could be managed, not a resource that had quietly departed. The architect of his own success, the mind behind the empire he had inherited and taken credit for building. She saw him understand it too late. She was almost sorry for him. Almost. The meeting adjourned at 11:15. Geoffrey Marsh walked with her to the elevator and said very quietly, "I want you to know that some of us knew." He looked straight ahead. "And I regret that knowing and doing nothing is a form of participation." Eleanor looked at him. She didn't offer absolution because she wasn't there for that. But she said, "Thank you for saying so." The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The story doesn't have a tidy ending, because the true stories never do. The Hartwell proposal was refiled 4 months later, with Eleanor Whitmore listed as primary creative and strategic architect. The Sanderson brief situation resulted in a disclosure to investors and a settlement negotiation that was, as these things always are, long and expensive and never quite satisfying to anyone. The Cole matter, Patricia Cole's estate, her methodology, her uncredited contribution, resulted in a separate case that took longer and was fought harder, and ultimately resulted in a formal acknowledgement and settlement that could not give Patricia back what she'd lost, but gave her daughter something that felt, in some imperfect way, like justice. Eleanor joined Diana Frost's firm as a partner in March, bringing with her a portfolio of work that was, in the generous words of the Financial Chronicle profile that ran in April, bypassing Marcus Osei's embargo with her explicit permission, proof that the most valuable mind in British luxury real estate development had been, for over a decade, effectively invisible. The invisibility, it turned out, was not a weakness. It was what allowed her to see everything. Alexander filed for divorce in February. Eleanor did not contest it and did not make it dramatic. She was busy. Margaret Hawthorne retired from the board in the spring. She issued a statement about devoting time to philanthropic pursuits. Eleanor read the statement and found she had no particular feeling about it, which seemed right. She found a flat she loved in Clerkenwell, with high ceilings and windows that faced east. She bought a new notebook. She slept, for the first time in years, without waking at 2 a.m., to solve someone else's problems. And then gradually, she found that she woke at 2 a.m. because she wanted to. Because the ideas were hers, entirely hers, going exactly where she directed them. She thought about Vanessa sometimes, not with warmth exactly, but with something that was not entirely without it. The complex, specific feeling of a woman who recognizes another woman's wound and does not have to approve of the behavior to understand the injury. They did not become friends. They were not the same. But when Vanessa's new consulting practice launched that autumn, Eleanor sent a brief, formal email of acknowledgement. which Vanessa answered with an equally brief and formal thank you, and that seemed about right. And sometimes, in the particular silence of her flat early in the morning, before London properly woke, Eleanor would sit at her desk with a cup of tea and the east light coming in and her notebook open, and she would feel the sheer, uncomplicated pleasure of existing exactly as she was, fully present, fully herself, taking up the space she had always deserved and simply forgotten to claim. She was not invisible anymore. She did not think she ever would be again. And in the offices of Hawthorne Global, in a meeting room on the 14th floor, there was a framed copy of the Hartwell proposal, correctly attributed now, her name in full at the top of the first page, that the new board had hung on the wall, not as tribute, as reminder. Eleanor had never asked them to do that, but she was glad they had.